Hey, I'm Anya, Realtor with Bosley Real Estate and host of Who's in My House, the Toronto Real Estate podcast with honest conversations and expert perspectives. Let's see who's in my house. So today I have City Councillor Bradford joining me. Welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. Do you want to just give a brief little background on who you are?
Sure. Yeah. City Councillor here in Toronto, Ward 19. For people that don't know ward numbers, that's Beaches, East York. And for Toronto audience, that's Coxwell to Victoria Park on the border of Scarborough there. The Beaches, the water, Lake Ontario, up to Sunrise, which is just south of Eglinton. Been City Councillor and elected since 2018. This is my second term. And before that, I was an urban planner. I worked in the chief planner's office at the City of Toronto, worked down in Boston, Massachusetts for a few years, and prior to that, private sector consulting in the city on transit projects, not the Eglinton Crosstown, mainly in Alberta, but that's kind of where I come from and my approach to the housing conversation.
Just because you said it, do you say the beach or the beaches? What is your take?
This is a real generational thing. I'm an 86 model.
Okay.
I didn't grow up here. I grew up in a little town down the QEW called Hamilton.
Hammer.
But yeah, that's right. But to me, it's plural because there are multiple beaches.
Okay.
So, it's not a singular thing. Even within the beaches, there's lots of beaches around the world. But here in Toronto, in the beaches, there are multiple beaches. So that's kind of, I'm not trying to cause any controversy about it.
There will always, I think, be controversy
around
that.
And you open up with the hardball question like that.
I had to only because you said your ward. So you come from an urban planning background. That's part of why I was hoping to speak with you. A huge topic in Toronto is always affordability. And so whether that's groceries, transit, childcare, but housing is generally at the center of it. So why do you think housing has become such a defining issue in the city?
I think you nailed it because it's affordability. And housing, whether that is your rent or your mortgage, is the biggest bill that most people are paying every month. And so, the challenge for a city like Toronto is people choose to come here. That's my story. I chose to come here, raise my two daughters here, grow a family, work here, build here. But if you can't have access to housing that you can afford, which is different than affordable housing, which is social housing, that's a separate conversation. But if you don't have access to housing that you can afford, then the dream and the opportunity and the potential of Toronto starts to slip away. And, increasingly we see that is more and more the case. Folks in my cohort, maybe folks in your cohort, they are fleeing the city of Toronto in a flight for affordability. 77,000 people left the city of Toronto last year out to the GTHA, interprovincial migration, even some folks north-south on the border. And so I think the biggest risk for Toronto is that we just sort of rest on our laurels, the sort of 20 years of investment and success that we've had, and assume that's going to continue. But if we don't start thinking critically about what local government can do to make housing more affordable, I think that's a trend that continues. And the risk on that is those are the people, those are the teachers, the mechanics, the folks who have been to school, the individuals who have gotten a trade. They are paying taxes. They are making bets as entrepreneurs. They're building things. They're creating prosperity and paychecks. And our future success depends on being a city where that middle class, those folks who want to build, that they can do it here in Toronto. And that's why we need to take some more significant action on the housing file to improve the prospects for young folks.
Yeah, there's been a lot of conversation recently that I've seen about how the middle class is slowly vanishing in Toronto. There's a huge divide between, and kind of middle class is slipping away for exactly the reason that you said, is either you fall into, kind of like a community housing cohort, or you can afford to buy ultra expensive real estate.
Right.
But the middle is kind of, I guess, disappearing.
Yeah. And this is the challenge is, the sort of traditional grand bargain that we've had in a country like Canada, go to school, get an education, get a trade, you're going to get a job, you're going to work hard, and you're going to have a pathway to the air quote middle class. Mm-hmm. Middle class is such a loaded political term because everybody thinks they're middle class. And of course, StatsCan would show you that that's not the case. But park that to the side for a second. It's, if you talk to my parents, if you talk to your parents, the dynamic of when you were able to come out of school and get a job and access either a high quality apartment that you could afford or get into the real estate market, it might have been maybe 3 or 4 times your annual income 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's anywhere from like 10 to 20 times somebody's annual income. So that gap has grown so significantly. And again, the challenge with affordable housing, and when I say that, I mean social housing, is there's long wait lists. But somebody who's a teacher or a mechanic, they make too much money to qualify for social housing, but they don't make enough money to be able to afford to live here. And those are the folks that we're losing all the time.
Yeah, that's a really tough spot to be in, is I make too much to be considered for community housing, but I don't make enough to actually be able to afford a market rate rental. And I mean, I don't know how much work you do within like rentals and your understanding of the rental market, but over the years, I've noticed this increasing trend of like a huge burden being put on tenants by landlords during the screening process. There are extreme requirements to demonstrate proof of funds, to demonstrate income, and they're expecting your income to be 3 times the rent. And for the average 1-bedroom rental, that means you need to be making $6,000 to $7,000 a month. What about the people making $40,000 a year? Where are they supposed to live?
And that's the challenge. And we can talk about some of the different zoning reforms that I had championed when I was the chair of planning and housing, and how we can introduce new supply in new neighborhoods and how that's part of the pathway. But you're exactly right. When new purpose-built rental in the city is going for $4.50, $5 a square foot, or at least that was the target market a few years ago, that's, you're going to be in a very small unit if those are the prices. Or if it's a more livable size unit, it's very, very expensive. And then you start having the conversation of like, if I'm putting that kind of money, if I'm spending $4,000 a month on rent, like, is there a pathway for me to actually put something into an equity building vehicle, purchase a condo or something? And so this is the challenge for people.
Yeah, definitely. And then, like you said, if someone wants to get into that pathway to buy, but they're sinking $3,000 a month into their 2-bedroom rental, then it's making it harder for them to put money aside to be able to actually get into a purchase. So it's just this cycle that is perpetuating. And
yeah, and I think really for the last 10 years, it's funny, we were just talking off camera about the 10-year 2026 versus 2016. Well, 2016 is when my wife and I bought our house. And it was a huge lift, right? Like it is for everybody. We didn't really have family support in that. We had saved up just a ton of money, right? Because it's 20% down at that point with the CMHC requirements. And I actually remember the moment when we transacted, and I had $6 left in my checking account. And like that was everything I had, and same with my wife, to be able to do that. And then, of course, you're whacked with like a double land transfer tax, which is special extra tax you pay here in the city of Toronto, effectively 12 years of property tax up front at a time when you've never had less money. Like you've never had less money, and we're hitting you with all these taxes up front. So Toronto has a lot of policies that I think are counterintuitive to affordability. They put a disproportionate amount of burden on first-time home buyers, and make it really hard to get in the market. So smart public policy conversations, if we believe that we want people to build equity, if we still believe that the Canadian dream includes a pathway to home ownership, I think Toronto has to do some reflection on the policies and the taxes that they put in place and the impact that has on affordability writ large for Torontonians.
I completely agree, and I will definitely have some questions for you about that. But just to kind of start broader, there are a lot of conversations I hear about housing that I feel like are maybe oversimplified is the term to use. People will say, well, just build more housing, that'll solve the problem. Or developers are charging too much. If they just charge less, then it'll be fine. And the best one is just if prices fall, everything will be fine. What are your thoughts on that?
A couple different buckets there, but I would say broadly speaking, politicians and the media have a tendency to play to the lowest common denominator and try and really simplify messaging. And I understand why you want to do that. You want to communicate with people broadly, but it sometimes, I think, does us a bit of a disservice. And a lot of politicians also want to, particularly populist politicians, maybe more so on the left, but they want to villainize or weaponize some of these issues. And so they want to, create this perception that it's the big greedy developer. They want to stigmatize the people that build housing. And, at the end of the day, it really just comes down to the math. And so we have a real trough of development in Toronto right now. The cranes that are up there, when they're coming down, they're not going back up again. Our current mayor is planting the flag of victory because nearly 2/3 of all housing starts this year are city initiated. To my mind, and this is where we differ, I suppose, in worldview, but to my mind, when 68% or 70% of all the housing starts are done by the government, that's actually like a red flag, because what that means is the market has completely collapsed. And it's not collapsed because people who build housing are villains or greedy. It's collapsed because the projects are no longer financially viable. You can't get financing from a bank for a project that loses money. And that's what people, I think, again, when we play to the lowest common denominator and just say, well, make less profit, make less money, the financialization of housing, like all these things. And they're very academic conversations, and it's a very online Twitter view. Mm-hmm. But the reality is, a builder can't go out and get a construction loan, construction financing, of course, on a project that is not generating a return. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of risk in building buildings and building housing. And so there has to be a reasonable rate of return on that. And when you look at the costs, for me as a local city councillor, we don't control the cost of construction or interest rates. We don't control the cost of labor, but we do control the cost of 30% of the taxes, development charges, red tape, and fees that are thrust upon every housing unit that comes to market in Toronto. And so, if we really wanted to create more housing that people could afford, one of the things that local government could do is have an honest conversation about the sort of well that politicians have gone back to, for the past decade, always trying to add more taxes and fees on housing because, there was a bull market run up for a while where you could get away with that, but they broke it. And the best thing that we could do is have an honest conversation about that and look at ways to reduce the taxes on housing, because that will improve the financing, that will improve the financial viability of these projects, and then we can get shovels in the ground and frankly get people back to work.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing too, because, so many of these pre-construction projects have stalled, but they've stalled because no one's buying. Because why would you pay $1,500 a square foot for a pre-construction condo when you can buy a resale for $950 a square foot? But the developers can't charge $950 a square foot because then they'll be losing money. And like you said, a big portion of that is development charges. So definitely curious to hear more about how you think that could be reduced in the future.
When the election kicks off this year in May, I'll be running for mayor. And one of the commitments I've said is I will reduce development charges by 25%, put some skin in the game here, and then push the feds in the province to match that. And the reason that's so important is over the past 15 years in Toronto, development charges have gone up by 1,200%. So wow. I'm drinking a cup of coffee here. You show me any other product anywhere in any market that has increased by 1,200% over 15 years. I haven't seen it, right? It's totally not sustainable. But DCs were just this thing that the previous administration went to all the time, ratcheting up to the point where it became, financially crippling for these projects. So my proposal to reduce it by 25%, that would be using the Housing Accelerator funding. I think it's about $480 million that the federal government has afforded Toronto to bring more housing online. And that's where I lean towards supply side solutions. That's where I lean towards market oriented solutions. But the trade-off of that, and again, for consideration with your audience, is the current administration, Mayor Chow, her approach is to be a public builder. So she's taking that money and effectively kind of putting on the hard hat and going swinging the hammer, wants the city of Toronto to build the housing. And that goes back to my point earlier about how, 2/3 of the project right now are public builder. My experience, both in the private sector and now at the city of Toronto, is that typically the government doesn't build things faster for less money than the private sector.
Right.
And when I look around Toronto right now, I don't see a shortage of qualified builders with the experience, expertise, and capital. I just see performas, which is the sort of financial modeling for housing. I see performas that don't work. So if we can improve that, then and have a rate of return that a bank can finance, and we can get shovels in the ground, more housing constructed, and ultimately that's a positive for everybody.
Totally. Now, taking it back to your background in urban planning, how do you feel urban planning influences housing on a day-to-day basis?
Oh, massive. It's the whole story of Toronto. Paul Bedford, who's a former chief planner, tells this story of the amalgamation journey here in Toronto, 20 some odd years ago. And the first consolidated official plan that was the new guiding document for all the different boroughs, Etobicoke, York, North York, Scarborough, Toronto, East York, everyone's coming together. And he describes it as the grand bargain, because they went out at the time and they talked to all the different residents associations. And effectively they said, we will direct the growth to the urban centers, 5 urban centers, and along the avenues, and we will not touch the neighborhoods. The neighborhoods will be status quo. And this was kind of the introduction of, you may have heard the term, Sean Galbraith, I think, kind of coined it, the yellow belt, the exclusionary zoning. And basically that said the only thing that you can build is, a single detached house in what was, I think, something like 63% of all residential zoning in the city of Toronto. Wow. And so the city, over the following 20 years, really developed in a way where we saw very, very tall towers in those centers, and then neighborhoods that were status quo. And then the avenues never really materialized, because that's a separate piece of it. But we made it so difficult through our urban design guidelines, the wedding cape vernacular, the angular planes, the setbacks, all this different stuff. We made it as complicated from a soft cost perspective to build a 6-story building as we did a 60-story building. So despite, it was Jennifer Keesman at the time, but her visions of Toronto is going to be like, Paris or London with all these mid-rise buildings, or even Washington, D.C., from a policy perspective, we made it virtually impossible to do it. So in a city that had more development activity than anywhere else on the continent, we only netted like 112 mid-rise buildings on our avenues. Wow. So the urban planning policy shapes, like, quite literally the form and the location and the direction of development. And I think in hindsight, in retrospect, you can look at a lot of those decisions over the past 20, 25 years and say it contributed to the challenges and the pressures that we're feeling from a housing perspective today.
This is on topic for zoning, but a little off topic. And you just brought back a memory for me. When I was in second year university, I did a co-op term with a commercial real estate investment trust. And part of my job was market research, and much of that included zoning, looking into zoning, what kind of zoning would allow for the type of projects they needed to build. And the city, I don't know if this has changed, you can correct me if it has, but at the time there were specific zones that fell under an older type of zoning that you couldn't confirm online, but you had to go to the local zoning office. And so here I was, a university student, I have no idea what's going on. I'm running to Etobicoke Civic Center and Scarborough Civic Center, asking them to find the zoning map for this one quadrant. And it was just if that's what developers need to be doing to figure out if they can build a 6-story building on Danforth, that's crazy.
Yep. No, you're right. And this is the consolidated bylaw, but sometimes I don't think you're allowed to say grandfathered anymore, but effectively the pre-zoning from the old borough or municipality would prevail. It would be the prevailing policy that would override, and so you'd have to go back and pull the bylaw from like Etobicoke, as you said, or East York or whatever, because that was the zoning that was relevant to that site. That was different than whatever the consolidated bylaw had.
Yep.
And you know, I think it's reflective more broadly of how the city of Toronto interfaces with residents, with customers, with people who want to build things. We make it a very arduous and difficult process. And while there have been some improvements in that, I think we have a long way to go. And there's so many other jurisdictions around the world that frankly do it better. That's the reason to be optimistic, frankly, about Toronto, is every problem that we have, whether it's housing or crime or public transit, safety, traffic, other cities have sort of figured this out. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just have to find the courage and the determination to go out and embrace new things and try something different. And then I think we can make some serious improvements.
And it's just so interesting because if like you said, zoning is such a big part of just A, being able to build, and B, being able to provide supply, I like how you kind of coined the difference between affordable housing and housing people can afford.
Right.
But let's just say housing people can afford. Like, why can't we just fix the zoning bylaws? Like, why is it so complicated if that's creating such a big obstacle to provide both affordable housing and housing people can afford?
Well, a couple of things have happened since that consolidated official plan. And when I was the chair of planning and housing, this was some of the work that I was leading. And you know, I'm proud to say that we've been able to move that forward. So we ended exclusionary zoning. You know, the RD, now I'm getting really specific, but that was the residential detached zoning that only allowed a single family home that was so prevalent within the R bin.
I actually somehow know that.
Yeah. So like now there's a lot more flexibility in what you can build. We've opened it up to multiplex. That was all stuff that I was leading on. I held the pen on something called the Housing Action Plan that had 52 different recommendations on how we could increase supply. And a lot of that stuff, to the civil service credit, has been moving forward. And, you know, even accessory dwelling units, laneway suites, garden suites, all of that is part of that package. And so it does look different than the RD yellow belt exclusionary zoning of even 5 years ago. But then there's a lot of stuff, T's that need to be crossed and I's that need to be dotted. You know, when you look at doing a multiplex and then you've got an ADU in the back, and again, these are great sort of family-oriented options in neighborhoods that used to be off limits. But then we're whacking you with development charges because as soon as you go over, 4 or 5 units, you're paying development charges, which of course breaks the pro forma for those projects. And meanwhile, to get funding from the federal government, it has to be 6 units or more. So we're in real specific stuff here. I've been able to resolve this, but these are the inconsistencies where our city staff will bring forward a policy that's not even aligned with the policies of another level of government, which are going to be essential to get the funding and the financing through CMHC to build these things. And that's where people, anyone that's watching this can see I don't have any hair, but if you're listening, I don't have any hair. But if I did, this is the stuff that you rip your hair out over.
Did you lose your hair because you were stressed about the zoning?
No. This was, I took it down to the wood when I was 27. I was always hoping I was going to make it to 30, but I didn't.
So close. So close.
Right there. I guess what I would just say, there has been a lot of work on zoning reform. Mm-hmm. The other piece is that's stuff that's happened at the city, but there's also been massive changes at the province that has really, when you think about the policy hierarchy, the provincial policy always supersedes whatever we're doing at the city. And we've had major changes from a provincial policy standpoint that have shaped the development approval process and the timelines and also minimum densities and where the density is going to go. So all that stuff is kind of out the window from where we were. And I guess that's why I keep coming back to cost and taxes, because that to me is still the biggest impediment that we're dealing with right now.
Yeah. And I see that from my perspective as, dealing with prospective buyers and homeowners is I mean, one piece is we're talking about, accessory dwelling units and getting creative with the type of housing you're building. For example, missing middle housing and kind of like a medium density mid-rise building. But I think people in Toronto have gotten so stuck on the very specific types of typical properties that you see that it's very hard to adapt and accept new options. So I'm slowly starting to see listings that are, like, for example, a garden suite or a laneway suite that were severed and are now their own lot that are trying to be sold. But it's tricky for buyers to wrap their heads around these unique or different types of properties because there's just not a lot of it out there. And so I think that's an interesting obstacle we might start seeing as the missing middle and the medium density housing starts being built more. Are people really going to be interested in these types of different products?
And I think it's what are the options available to me? And so if I'm really committed to being in Toronto, and we're all looking at, like, not me, I'm pretty locked in on Toronto, but I tell this story. I play softball down in the beaches, and inevitably every year one of the guys on the team announces that he's having a kid, new baby coming, or maybe a second, and then we all sort of brace for, like, the next messages, and I'm moving to Hamilton, or I'm moving to Aurelia, or I'm moving to Durham region, because everyone's evaluating the money that they have and what that can afford them and what kind of space and lifestyle they can secure with their paycheck. And a lot of the time it's a better option for people to be elsewhere, especially if they're raising a young family. Yep. I came across a statistic the other day that was quite jarring in a sense. Do you know what the number one demographic age band that is leaving Toronto is?
Gotta say, like 30 to 40.
It's 0 to 5.
Right, because it's all the kids.
Because they have the kids and then they leave. So that kind of illustrates it to me. So when you look at ADUs, when you look at a garden suite, when you look at a multiplex, to my mind, that in many cases is a better option for people to be in a amenity-rich neighborhood with lots of parks and maybe schools and pools, things like that. It's another option that is maybe a little bit more family forward and focused. And I think rather than just building the, as people say, the shoebox in the sky, which was a product of an investor model, which is a product of tax changes, in the 90s that really disincentivized purpose-built rental, and then the condo market became a pseudo rental market. But if you're contrasting, if you're contrasting, like, do I want to live in a 500 square foot condo, or do I want to live in a, 650 square foot or 700 square foot multiplex apartment in a neighborhood? Maybe the neighborhood option is more appealing, and maybe that's a pathway for more people to stay and raise a family in Toronto, which I think is really important.
Yeah, and just to go back to what you said about the, the softball and the dad waiting for that message. I was having coffee with a client a couple of weeks ago who had their second kid, and they were telling me about how everyone in the friend group is in this position where they're in your typical Toronto semi, 3 beds, 2 baths, and they're running out of space, as you do once you have kids. Kids have a lot of stuff, takes up a lot of space.
And all these semis, because we're in something similar, a tiny little railroad worker place off of Danforth, built in 1920s. No closets.
No closets.
And the kids have a lot of stuff.
Kids have so much
so
stuff.
So it is just kind of everywhere. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, so your house will never not be messy.
No, and then we all sort of, like, in the dad and mom's groups and the WhatsApp chats, you're frantically cleaning when someone's coming over. And I'm just always saying to my wife, I'm like, but, like, everybody lives like this.
Yes.
Like, let's just be honest.
Yeah, let's just leave. It's our kid stuff anyways. Yeah. It's not like it's anyways. But that conversation that I was having with my client was like, well, now everyone in the friend group is having these discussions of, do we stay and find ways to make our space work for us in these 3-bed, 2-bath semis with no closets? Or do we start exploring the option of upsizing if that's financially feasible, or do we need to leave the city? And I think that's a really big conversation. And when I started in real estate, I was working with a lot of first-time buyers, and now a lot of those first-time buyers are becoming the upsizers who need more space. And so now this is a big conversation I'm having with clients of, can we manage in the space we have, or do we need to find more space? And can we find more space in the city, or do we have to leave?
I mean, like, it's so real. Like, that's a real conversation in our house right now. You know, we got a 5-year-old and a 2.5-year-old. We got wagons and strollers and scooters and Barbie
Bikes.
dream houses and all. It's all nice stuff to have, but they're, you know, it's real. The conversation: do you stay? Do you pare down? And you know, it's a nice conversation to have, to be in that position where you're having that discussion. But it also, I think there is a push factor where people consider other markets. And then again, that goes back to that 0 to 5 demographic being the number one leaving the city of Toronto.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting point. I never would have guessed that. Another thing that I've thought about that we used to have a lot of in Toronto and is pretty common in other countries is multi-generational living. I think that could also be a big help to the kind of finding housing you can afford. Maybe you can find a nice duplex and, you know, you and your sibling each have your own unit. I know a couple of people who are in positions like that. Or maybe you find a duplex and have your in-laws living in one of the suites, and then now you also have built-in childcare along with help to pay the mortgage.
Well, note to my in-laws, like, I would love that.
Maybe you build a garden suite.
Yeah.
And then you move them in.
Yeah.
I've joked with my mom about doing that. She does not like that joke.
Well, but that's right. You know, I lived down in Boston, Massachusetts. I was working down there for a few years, and they had what we are now calling multiplex, but triple decker New England format, where each floor is a separate condo. But, you know, 150 years ago, when a bunch of these were built, it was multi-generational housing. And that is the idea. You know, your parents can sort of age in place. They can help with some of the childcare costs. And then I guess supposedly when your kids become adult children, they got a spot too.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense. And, you know, in many respects, that was probably formed or forged out of necessity 150 years ago.
Totally.
And we might be moving back in a direction where increasingly that's warrants consideration, because I always talk, you know, about my friends who are having to leave the city. But the other side of the same coin is when I go out and I hear from parents who have adult children, and they say, yeah, like, I'm here in the beaches, but now my kids and my grandkids have moved to London, Ontario. Yeah. And I never see my grandkids, or they're in Aurelia. Yeah. I keep saying Aurelia because that's where my sister lives. But that's a problem for them as well. If they want to be involved in stuff, like, they're happy to, and they want to stay in Toronto, but their kids can't afford it. And so they're out of market. And now it's like 2 to 3 hours to go see the grandkids. And then, you know, from that perspective, they're not exactly around to give a helping hand in a convenient way either.
Yeah. And so another question for you is, how do you think land can be better utilized here? Obviously, like, you know, surface parking lots, low-rise buildings. Do you think there's something that can be done?
Yeah, it's, you know, it's funny. I had a conversation with community members about a development application in the ward, and, you know, they didn't like it, and there were some issues with the file, and it wasn't without its challenges, but sometimes they would just say, like, well, why doesn't the developer just build somewhere else? And we kind of say, well, because this is the land that they own. You know, like, I don't know if they have other parcels. That's really their business. But like, you know, this is the land that they have. So this is where they're building on it. You know, there's lots of opportunities to, I think, better utilize land in the city of Toronto. The city of Toronto is a huge landholder in the city, and we have underutilized lots, surplus lots, lots of them that are just storage of old equipment or different pieces that are part of, you know, sort of easements and, you know, land that's just not highest best value. Yep. I think from a zoning perspective, having some flexibility around live work, even on major streets. Totally. The city planning policy is so dogmatic and has fought that for so many years. And yet you think about today's context, if we want to incentivize entrepreneurs and builders and people who are going to start a business, well, they might not be able to afford, you know, $5,000 rent and then another $10,000 commercial lease on a monthly basis. Yeah. Or a $5,000 mortgage and then $50,000 on commercial rent. So if you built in that flexibility from a zoning perspective to have those live work units, that would be helpful in terms of small business and entrepreneurs. And the pushback from the dogmatic planners is, well, live work units don't provide activation on the street. That is a less active storefront. And I say, well, what about all the zoning that dictates you have at-grade retail on a street like Danforth, where, like, you know, a third of it is vacant anyways, or the development that you prescribe must have at-grade retail, and then everyone moves into the building, the retail sits vacant for 3 years, and then you get like another nail salon or dry cleaners.
If you go up to Gerrard and you walk past, I mean, the strip of Gerrard close to where I live is like 50% of the storefronts are just people are living there and the windows are blacked out.
Yeah.
And so I totally hear what you're saying there.
And it's just another example of like these policies that exist and we just sort of accept. We just accept it like, well, that's because that's how it's always been.
Yeah.
But nobody challenges that. And it's like a thread on a sweater. You start to pull it and it all unravels because, again, it might be a nice idea to say we want vibrant streets and active fine grain retail and all this stuff that you get in motherhood planning documents. But then there's the reality of what happens. Like, you can't lease out or sell the commercial space. It takes years. People are living in the building. So it's just got a brokerage sign in the window for 3 years. And then you get the like sort of vibrant retail of a dry cleaner. And so I just think sometimes we need to be a little bit more sober and honest about what we're working with and where we're headed. And there's lots of other things that we could do that might challenge the assumptions that have governed planning in this city for 20 years, but could probably actually give us better outcomes.
Well, I think a big piece of it is people are afraid of change, and we've gotten so used to the status quo that even though these changes aren't scary and they really wouldn't be negatively impacting residents, we're just so used to things being the way they are that any notion of change is very scary and brings opposition.
We've had like a kind of a decade of drift and a decade of decline in many respects in Toronto, and this resignation towards mediocrity that
back to 2016.
Yeah, that I think is unhelpful. Like, Toronto has all the ingredients to be the best city in the world. It really does. And I know we're not there yet, but we could be. And, we've got the best hospitals in the world. We have fantastic universities. We have a very highly skilled and trained workforce. There's tons of capital here. It's the cradle of AI. We need to do a better job commercializing that. But all the ingredients here are here to be a great city. But sometimes it feels like Toronto is shooting for bronze and content with coming in fourth. And so
yeah, I hear you.
Status quo is too much of a guiding principle at City Hall and with our political leadership too. And I think that we should be a city that is more bold and has more ambition. And if we can try some new things, I think we would probably really like the results. But to your point, change is hard, but leadership is about managing change. And I think we need leadership that wants to embrace change rather than leadership that is content with what we've got right now.
Yeah, I also think a big piece of it is being intentional with where we're building and like transit-oriented neighborhoods, things like that. Obviously Ontario Line construction is underway, and kind of I'm seeing, especially in my area, that there is a focus on building more density around where the stations will be. So I think that's also a big piece of it because people need infrastructure.
And that's part of the provincial changes we were talking about, this major transit station area planning policy. And you know what? It makes sense because if as taxpayers, we're spending billions of dollars putting infrastructure in the ground, we get a better return on that investment if more people can use it. Mm-hmm. More people can use it if they're close to transit. So the rationale and the logic checks out on this. But again, it's different than how we have done it, because go take a stroll on Danforth. Again, you got $1 billion of subway infrastructure in the ground, and most of the buildings are 2 stories.
Yeah. Burning East End question.
Yeah.
What is the deal with the Lakeshore exit on the Gardiner? Are we getting it back ever? Do you know?
It's wild. You're a little bit further west than I am, so you've got a few more options to kind of get across the Don. But I'm Danforth, Woodbine, Danforth, Maine, and everybody in Beaches East York traverses down Woodbine and across Lakeshore to get on the Gardiner.
And then you have to fight people at the Jarvis entrance.
Yeah, it's brutal. honestly, that shows the disconnect between the bureaucrats, some of the politicians, and the people who are trying to live their lives here in Toronto. That was a 2015 decision, so before my time. But, there were people that were advocating to tear down the Gardiner in its entirety.
Whole thing?
Yeah.
And
how part of that 2015 discussion.
How are we going to get anywhere?
Well, and even Mayor Chow in her campaign in 2023 was advocating to tear down the Gardiner because, again, there's an online sort of audience for this that is very disconnected from the real world. If you take an elevated expressway that is full all the time and you drop it down onto Lakeshore, which is also jammed all the time, what do you think is going to happen? And
it already takes an hour to get from Toronto to Toronto.
That's the joke. And the Pollyanna universe is like, well, everyone's going to just take transit. Well, transit's not safe, not reliable. And I also can't take the transit that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Right. So like this is, I understand where we need to go as a city, but that is like going to take decades and decades and decades of sustained transit building. And as we've seen in Toronto, we're not exactly very good at that. So, it was frustrating that there was so much political debate about tearing the entirety of the Gardiner down. But John Tory at the time struck this compromise to sort of realign the Gardiner, push it north, align it with the railroad tracks, but lose access to the East End. And I think that was such a mistake because for everybody, east of the Don, trying to get up onto the Gardiner, which is still a really key arterial road, they don't, they won't have that option until they get to Cherry Street in the 2030s. And for East End residents and folks out in Scarborough, it has made it so much more difficult to live here. And again, it's the quality of life question that all of this housing stuff circulates around because you have now added mega time to your commute. It's harder to get back to the job site, harder to get into the office, and it takes longer to get home to your family at the end of the day. And that is just not as appealing. It makes living in Toronto less appealing and more difficult.
Yeah, I'll never forget. So 2015 decision, and I want to say they didn't do it until like 2022?
21, I think.
21, okay.
And that was a challenge too. I can tell you as a local elected official because people obviously aren't paying attention to a 2015 decision.
6
and
years
I just
later.
remember like CB24 had the choppers up in the sky if they're like tearing it down and everyone's like, what is going on? What's happening with the Gardiner? And then, you're trying to explain, no, this was decided in 2015. And,
well,
and then all of a sudden everyone's getting rooted up to like Don Mills South, like up at O'Connor. And that's now how I get rooted to get back to my place, which is not the most direct route, right? And all the traffic chaos that has caused both on the DVP and the off ramps. And it's just unintended consequences. And it was so poorly considered. It was the wrong decision at the time. And now all of us are sitting here suffering through it.
The East Enders are so upset.
And that's why, like, local government matters and, who you have making these decisions. And I think a lot of the time, unintended consequences or knock-on consequences from this stuff is not really considered. And, we're all dealing with the consequences.
Yeah, I remember that because I, as most people wasn't paying attention to the decision in 2015. And I went away the week that they tore it down and came back. And I was like, where'd the Gardiner go? And it's so funny because it's now been 4 years, 5 years? Oh my gosh, 5 years. That's crazy. And if you look at it, like literally it's just cut. Like it's still there. It looks like someone chopped the highway and it's just sitting there, opening.
We should start a ramp back campaign. Ramp back.
I like it.
Yeah. No, seriously, it's like it was such a mistake. And again, I look at everything through the life of, now I'm a dad, drive my kids around, all that sort of stuff, and quality of life in Toronto, and it has objectively made it more difficult in the East End now. Not impossible, but more difficult, less convenient. Yeah,
totally. And then that adds to the traffic on the roads, which then slows down transit because most of the people unless you're along Danforth and Bloor, like if you're not there, you're taking the streetcar, which means you are stuck in the same traffic as everyone else. So it really, like, transit also isn't necessarily the solution.
Well, and that's like a longer conversation, maybe another episode, but we're very nostalgic about streetcars in Toronto. We're like, oh, it's such a Toronto thing. Well, it's a Toronto thing because basically every other major metropolitan area in North America got rid of them. Like, we kept them, but and San Francisco has some like tourist ones that are still there, but the vast majority of cities recognize that streetcars, now we bought the long ones, which are even more problematic, but when you put them in mixed traffic, it is a rolling stop sign, and everybody is just jamming it, trying to swing around them between parked cars. You've got pedestrians, transit customers getting on and off the vehicles. It is not a good optimized system to shoehorn into the right of way. And I'm convinced, now in hindsight, looking back, I think he took a lot of flack for it at the time, but former Mayor Rob Ford was right. Like, this stuff needs to be underground, or at least in a completely separate right of way, not mixing with traffic, because it doesn't work when it's, signal priority and trying to go through intersections. It's not compatible.
Yeah, well, even I've noticed some roads are starting to have the like the red paint TTC only line, and cars don't understand what that means, so they still just go in that lane.
Yeah, bus priority lanes, and that can work in some instances, but I think we've also just followed a sort of ideological pursuit to put it in places where, frankly, the transit surface is not reliable enough, inconsistent enough, and their argument would be this makes it more consistent. But when you take Bathurst and you remove 50% of the road capacity for all those vehicles and dedicate one lane to either buses or bikes or whatever, there is a massive knock-on impact for everybody who is unfortunate enough to be stuck in a vehicle, because I contest that driving in Toronto is not a positive thing. It's actually a nightmare driving in Toronto. And you say, well, take transit. That might be an option that works for some people, but if it doesn't work for your commute or where you're headed, or even from a safety perspective or reliability, then you're handcuffed to a vehicle, and that's not a nice experience in the city.
Yes, 90% of my job is being in my car, and
well, this is it, and like if you're going to different, showings or construction sites or clients, like that's it. You can't jam around on transit. You can't necessarily ride a bike everywhere. No. So we just have to be real about how Toronto has evolved. We're a big city, 630 square kilometers, and people have to get around in different ways. And local government ought not to be making it more difficult with every decision to drive a car. I know that there's always going to be bad traffic, but until we have actual transit options, not just north, south, east, west, but a real transit grid that functions and is safe, it's not going to be a viable option for a lot of people.
Yeah, I hear you. So just to kind of bring it back to housing, we've spent a lot of time talking about zoning and kind of how we got here. And so just to do a pulse check on the two biggest, I would say, obstacles or difficulties I'm seeing on the ground with housing is single family homes, the pressure, because there is a lot of demand for starter homes, people that want to get into a freehold. If we're talking East End, there was a house at Pape and Danforth 2 weeks ago, had 17 offers. Last week a couple days ago, I was offering on a house in Midtown, had 6 offers. These are now 16 buyers that need to go find another house. And so there is a ton of demand pressure on these starter homes that are homes people can afford, which is then pushing those prices up. And then on the flip side, we have thousands of condos sitting on the market that were built, like you said, for investors. End users are not interested in living in these poorly laid out shoeboxes, so they're not buying them, and we just have this oversupply of condos sitting on the market.
Is the question, what do we do about this?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you fix it?
What did that one go for that had 16 or 17 offers on it?
1.7, just over 1.7?
1.7.
Yeah.
1.7 starter-ish.
I would say that's a bit over starter, but the one in Midtown with 6 offers was 1.2. Which
semi,
which 1.2 at Yonge and Eglinton is very much a starter price for the area.
Right.
So a lot of people at a 1.2 price point wouldn't necessarily be able to get into that area. So I think that drove a lot of the traffic.
That's interesting. Yeah. Been out of the game for a little while, but the numbers still blow your mind, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's right. There's so much competition and continues to be. And I think when we did ours, we had 12 or 13 offers on our place.
Yeah.
So when you win that, you always sort of feel like, oh God, like we bid higher and spent more than anybody else. It's not really like a great feeling. And I think for young folks, young couples, young families, there's a lot of anxiety that comes with that.
It's a very emotional process.
Yeah. And we went on 6, I think, before we got one in the area.
Had lost 6. Yeah.
So then you're very motivated.
Yeah. Well, you lose your first one. That's always the worst because you're like, this was awful. I never want to do this again. And then you kind of get used to it. And, you know, it's really, I mean, the first time I lost when I was house shopping, and this is my job, I cried.
Yeah.
I could barely get off the phone with the agent.
No, it's very emotional. I think the challenge is there are all these surplus units in the market. And yeah, when it was an investor-driven model, and people talk about that like it's a super negative thing, I think there are both upsides and downsides to that. You know, downsides, of course, was it dictated the type of product that people didn't really care about the quality of the living experience in it. It was whatever. It's a place to park capital. They thought that they were getting appreciation on the uplift of the unit over years. Relatively safe investment in Toronto at the time. You know, the upside was, given our financial models, like you need to have 70 or 80% of pre-construction sales to get construction financing.
Yep.
So, like, now there's no sales, so you can't.
So there's no financing.
So there's no financing. So there's no projects
are just
starting.
Getting canceled.
Yeah.
And then in 10 years, we're gonna be looking for all the new supply.
This is exactly right. So you know this. So you know, I don't know. Maybe we have 25, 30,000 sort of surplus units in the market right now. Maybe they get absorbed over the next 18 to 24 months. But then on the other side of that is there's no new supply because nothing is starting. And I think that we talk about the housing challenges, affordability crisis today, and there's been some softening, but forecast 4 or 5 years from now, because it still takes, even if things are going fast, takes a few years to build these things, like 3, 4, 5, 8 or 9.
Well, first takes time to go through red tape to get
and
everything.
zoning.
Yep. First you need to get the land, then you need to get the approvals, then you need to sell 70%, then you break ground. Like it's a long and drawn out process. And
so there's that supply that exists today, but that will be absorbed, I believe, you know, if we continue, if what we feel to our core is true about Toronto, that is still a great city that people want to be at. And again, can't take that for granted. But if we continue and we course correct and we make sure that this is a destination for talent, people, and capital, then those units inevitably will be absorbed. Yeah. But on the other side of that, governments at all levels have effectively broken the model, you know, around investor-oriented units, which means there's no financing right now, which means nothing started. And so I actually really worry about what the market looks like in 28, 29 when there's no new supply because we took a 3-year hiatus from building anything, which is a problem.
Yeah, I worry about this as well.
Yeah.
My hair is slowly falling out.
Yeah, okay. Still got a lot more than me.
Yeah, well, give me time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is something that I worry about because there is, and I fear that the new supply that we will get will not be different than what we have. And so our development charges, they're higher the more bedrooms there are. Is that correct?
Correct.
Right. So
a bit counterintuitive.
Yes, because we need more 2-bed, 3-bed units. So families can actually live in condos and can fit in condos. But then those units are, if you were to look at how much a 3-bedroom condo costs that is livable, it is almost the same as buying a house.
Well, and here's the disconnect in our policy and our finances and all this stuff. The city of Toronto would say we want more family size units. They would say we want more 2 and 3 bedroom units. We will prescribe the amount of units by percentage that have to be of 2 and 3 bedrooms in a project. So we have something called the growing up guidelines. So 20% have to be comprised of 2 and 3 bedroom units. Great. Everybody likes the sound of that on paper. But then there's more development charges for 2 and 3 bedroom units. So they are inherently more expensive. We're talking about affordability for families to be in those 3 bedroom units. And the math doesn't work on that because I don't know what it is now. Is it $1,200 buildable, $1,500 saleable?
Something like that.
Yeah. So
in and around there.
whatever, or $1,100 buildable. So in a 3 bedroom unit, there's just more square footage. So they are inherently more expensive, and the government, local government, makes it more expensive by charging more development charges on top of that, despite dictating that you have to build these and that we want to see them. And so that's a disconnect between our policy goals and aspirations and the financing and the taxation side that actually makes that much less achievable.
Yeah. It feels like we've gotten ourselves into this just like never ending cycle of issues that feed into each other that continue to feed into each other. And it's just,
yeah. And you ask the question to the politicians or to the bureaucrats, it's not cheaper to build a 3 bedroom unit. The cost per square foot is the same. There is more square footage involved. You're taxing it more, but you want this to be affordable for families. So like, how does that square? And then it effectively market units and other units in the building are going to end up cross subsidizing or carrying those bigger units, which are always the last to transact. But then that drives up the cost of those other units that are doing the cross subsidy within the performer in the project.
Yeah. So what power does the city actually have with respect to housing, out like compared to federally and provincially?
Well, every level of government has a role to play. The federal government's embarking on this public builder thing. I'm really cool on the idea in general, but, stay in my lane. I'll focus on the city. But the federal government's ACLP, Apartment Construction Loan Program, where they offer low-cost financing through CMHC, that is a winner. Like, do more of that.
And sorry, is that specifically for purpose-built rentals or also condos?
I think it might be both, but
Okay.
it's definitely purpose-built rental.
Okay.
For sure, it's PBR. But bottom line is that's what people need. If we are moving away from an investor model where people are, pre-sale buying shoeboxes in the sky, then they need access to low interest financing. And that is a great place for the federal government. So that program, which is always oversubscribed and fully deployed, put more money into that so that you can get more capital out in the market and get people building. The provincial government, I think, has been helpful with some of the zoning changes that they've made, some of the process changes that they've been doing to speed up the timeline. We've now gone through really significant changes that shorten the zoning approval process. In a sense, though, municipalities have just kicked that down to site plan. So now the province, I think, needs to step in and bring the same sort of reform and changes to the site plan process. And then local government, it does come back to being faster and proceeding with urgency when it comes to approving housing, reforming and modernizing our zoning, which we've been doing. And then the big thing right now is taxes and fees and getting serious about putting some skin in the game on that stuff, because that is one of the things that will move the needle and nudge us closer to financial viability on these projects, which is ultimately the go, no-go when it comes to starting something.
On the topic of starting things, can you talk about 72 Amroth?
Yeah, look at you here plugged in on this
Did
stuff.
research.
Yeah, I love it.
I have cue cards.
So 72 Amroth, again, when I was the chair of planning and housing, we wanted to sort of pilot a new form of missing middle, something neighborhood-oriented, green pea parking lot, underutilized, and what lessons could we learn to optimize this process so that it would be replicable at scale across the city. And again, the idea of working with the builders in that missing middle space, trying to understand from a government perspective what are the roadblocks that we self-impose on these projects. And our sort of land development agency, Create TO, went through the city's own process and learned the extent and it was extensive. But the extent of roadblocks and studies and hurdles and process that didn't work for that missing middle format. And what comes out of that is lessons learned and ultimately policy changes that we can make across the board so that these things are more viable. Where it stands right now is there's going to be, they're out in the market doing an offer looking for bids from builders that would go and construct this. And, it'll be a purpose-built rental building, several of them courtyard, very cool infill, but again, the type of gentle density that you could see on streets adjacent to transit that are still very much in keeping with the feel and the vibe of the neighborhood, but will provide like great quality apartments in a really prime location.
Well, and it's funny because you look at a place like Manhattan, which sometimes it feels like Toronto wants to get there.
Yeah.
When is the last time you saw a surface parking lot in Manhattan?
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know that I've ever seen one.
Yeah, it'd be probably one of the most expensive surface parking lots in the world.
And that's the thing is we have all these surface parking lots and like all this land that clearly is not highest and best use that could be more housing, could be more infrastructure, but it's not. Mm-hmm. And that is just adding to the pile. Yep.
It adds to the pressure, and again, it's something that government can do is unlock underutilized land, and find a way to do something of a higher value. And in this case, it's housing. I think you're trying to find a balance because, again, for all the conversation we've had about how difficult it is to get around Toronto, when you do get to a destination, you need to have a place to park, and we know parking's very expensive to construct, hugely expensive. But doing it at the surface is not highest best. And if there's opportunities for JVs, joint ventures with Green P, Toronto Parking Authority, and others, like that's probably worthy of consideration. Not on a small site like this where you're only doing 32 or 34 units.
Sure.
Can't do it.
Yeah.
But on some of the bigger stuff in different locations, I think it's still worth exploring that in earnest.
Yeah. Are there any neighborhoods or housing projects that you think should be or could be used as an example for future projects?
Well, that's the idea. Hopefully 72 Amroth pencils out and we get some good builders to come in and do that. But the lessons learned from that, because again, like that required variances from our own process, and our own bylaws, and the lessons that we learned as the city kind of going through our own entitlement process was very illuminating. It's the stuff that anyone in the private sector has been fighting for 20 years and they're aware of. But I think it really behooves local government to try and navigate your own process and see how cumbersome and difficult you've made it. There's lots of great historic neighborhoods in Toronto. The sort of missing middle archetype is actually not new. Like you have that in the beaches, you have that in Long Branch and Etobicoke, you have that in the Annex. Some of the great neighborhoods in Toronto have this, what would have been multi-generational apartments, but neighborhood oriented apartments that fit in really well and provide really great quality housing options. And, again, amalgamation, we moved away from all of that stuff. So you don't have to look to what's new. In some respects, look to what's 100 years old and say, is there a pathway to do that?
Yeah, and what did they do right?
And now we've set the table for that. And I think we just need market conditions to sort of improve before we start seeing more of that going forward.
Right. And are there any small changes that you think could make a big impact on affordability and livability?
I think, again, aligning our development charge regime, we've got to go back to what qualifies as appropriate use of development charges. I think we have to right size that. It's just way too broad. The other side of that is, this is kind of taking us in the weeds, but our procurement and our capital delivery at the city is not good. We pay too much. We have too few contractors offering because it's too cumbersome to work with the city of Toronto. So nobody wants to bid on our stuff. As a result, the people that do charge us more money. And, I will point out that we have $3 billion sitting in a development charge reserve account, $3 billion that has been collected when permits are pulled on DCs to pay for the community centers and the pools and the parks to support the growth. It's just sitting there. That's capital that's sitting that hasn't been deployed. Now, our CFO will say, yeah, but Brad, we have $6 billion booked to it. $6 billion of cost booked to that $3 billion. But that there, reflects the problem of we're so slow getting stuff out the door that the cost escalation, I'm not talking like 12 months, I'm talking like 12 years before stuff gets out the door. So we collect the money at a finite point in time, but then costs have escalated so rapidly. So there is this big gap. So we do have to fix capital delivery. We do have to fix our procurement process if we want to right-size development charges, which I think is so important to our ability to have housing that people can afford here in Toronto.
Yeah. So just to kind of round things off, I know you mentioned that you do intend on running for mayor again this year. If you are not ready to answer any of these questions, you totally don't have to. Like if this is waiting until the campaign starts. But I was wondering what would be some changes that you would plan on implementing immediately if you were elected?
Thanks for giving me an out, because we will be, once the campaign formally starts, we're going to have lots of different policy prescriptions and roll out. But I have committed to that 25% reduction of development charges. And I've identified the offset, the housing accelerator funding. I would not be a public builder anymore. That is something that, I think is... If it does yield any affordable housing, it'll be the most expensive affordable housing in the country's history. So I don't think that's the way to do it.
Right.
So I'll reduce the development charges. But there's lots of different stuff that I've talked about over the years from policy perspective, from my time in incentive planning and chairing Planning and Housing Committee. That would be telling and telegraphing some of the things that I want to do. But you're dealing with somebody who is grounded in the practical, and someone who is very focused on not just political rhetoric, but things that are actually going to deliver results. And I have the clarity of mission and focus of knowing what we're fighting for. And, I think this city is worth fighting for, but it's for the people who want to call Toronto home, for the people who are struggling to continue to stay here. And like you said off the top, you're right. Housing is affordability, because housing is your biggest bill for most people every month.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of things that we could do to alleviate some of that pressure, and to make Toronto a city that actually wants to build, wants to embrace growth, rather than the default process, which seems to be throwing up roadblocks at every turn and making it very difficult, cumbersome, and expensive to do it.
Yeah, well, I think housing is at the center of almost every conversation about, people who live in Toronto, and like it's almost become a sport. Everyone's looking online to see what the house on their street sold for, or what did this house sell for, or what did that sell for. It's become a sport. And so I think a continued emphasis on housing is really important in the city, because it is at the core of the issues that residents are experiencing.
Yep, that's right.
Okay, and again, you share as much as you are able to share at this time. What would be some kind of early priorities versus long-term goals?
I think, we've sort of lost the plot over the past 10 years because we've tried to be all things to all people. The city of Toronto feels like it's spread itself a mile wide and an inch deep, and we haven't had leadership at the helm in a long time that is, not afraid to do some of the difficult but necessary things. So when I go across Toronto, I hear different versions of the same story over and over. And the priorities for me are pretty clear. It comes down to crime, congestion, and cost of living, the 3 C's. And there will be different policy prescriptions in all of those things, whether we're talking about safety on the TTC or reliability, or, your ability to get from the East End up to the hockey rink at Downsview Park and it not take an hour and a half, or cost of living, whether we're talking about housing, your biggest bill every month, or the biggest bill you get every year, which is taxes. Double land transfer tax, luxury home tax, vacant home tax. Like, it seems like with this administration, and even the previous administration, the first, second, and third response to everything is more taxes, more fees, more staff. But there hasn't been enough work done to say, what are the core services of local government? Cleaning up the snow, not that great at that. Keeping the pools open in the summertime during a heat wave, making sure that, I don't have to get up at 6 a.m. and have every electronic device in my house open to register for my daughters for swimming lessons, smashing refresh, like the Hunger Games.
That's not new, because I remember when I was a kid, my mom did the same thing. Like, she had to wake up at she'd wake up at 5 a.m. and be like waiting to. But that's the point. We keep coming back to this
this culture of status quo. You just said that's not new. Yeah, exactly. We've been dealing with the same issues with the same leaders that don't get the urgency that I would suggest you or I do in addressing some of these things.
Right.
So we have to do a better job at the basics. And I do think we have to have a vision where we want to make Toronto the best city in the world, full stop. The best city to raise a family and to build a business and to unlock our collective potential. And if we do that, then I think we can have, you know, a Toronto that we can be really proud of. And I think that's what everybody wants.
Okay, well, I think that was a great way to end things off. I don't know that I want to make you say more now.
Thanks. We've said a lot, but I really appreciate you having me on the pod. It's a cool podcast, and you've been doing it for a while. And so kudos for bringing these conversations to all your listeners. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming and for giving me the insight into what's going on with development charges in the city.
Once we fix it, we'll come back and we'll take a victory lap.
We'll do a recap. Yeah, we can do a recap.
Awesome.
Okay. Thank you.